welcome to TPPF's Policy Primer on home rule school districts, charter campuses, and local control. My name is James Golsan. I'm the Education Policy Analyst here, and I wanted to start by thanking you all for coming out and participating in what I think should be a great panel here at TPPF. Home rule schools are maybe not one of the most well-known provisions of the Texas Education Code. When I say school choice or virtual learning or vouchers, you've all got a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. With a home rule school, that might not be as clear. What a home rule school district is, home rule schools are school districts that can operate free of many state requirements that govern our traditional independent school districts. They've got more flexibility in how they compensate their educators, how they choose their curriculum, among other freedoms. They're designed, in theory, to grant more control at the local level to parents and educators, so that public schools in a home rule district can be specifically tailored to meet the needs of their student base. However, as the law is currently written, home rules still have a great deal in common with traditional ISDs. They're still subject to a number of state mandates, including as far as class size caps are concerned, graduation rates, attendance requirements, as well as a number of other mandates outlined in more detail in TPPF's paper, which you've got at y'all's seat today. They're virtually indistinct from traditional ISDs in those regards. This lack of separation is likely at least partially responsible for the fact that Texas currently has no home rule charters in effect. TPPF believes that there is a great deal of room for positive change in the home rule law. Freeing up these districts from more state-driven mandates, such as the 22-to-1 K-4 class size cap and seat time requirements for students, could allow home rule districts to be run more efficiently, than traditional ISDs, and free up school administrators to invest their education dollars to meet the needs of their students. Home rule schools in Appleton would have an opportunity to make staffing decisions that better fit their needs, an opportunity to decide locally how best to run their budgets, and more money to invest in educational tools like learning technologies. Indeed, home rule districts could become the seed ground for a bloom of expanded blended learning in Texas, where technology is used to let students and teachers improve the learning experience for both the needs of the individual and the classroom as a collective. At present, however, Texas is a long way from this goal. As well as changes to the rules that apply to home rule districts, the state should look at altering the process through which home rule schools can be created. The current laws make it extremely difficult for a charter to get through the local election process, requiring a substantial voter turnout. Further, citizens and parents are not sufficiently empowered to drive the charter process. A vital component of any local control expansion is an empowered base of parents and voters. And that's what home rule schools are ultimately about: local control of the community's public schools and more power in the hands of voting citizens. I want to note that as well as more control at the district level, TPPF's proposal, again outlined in the paper, includes a strengthening of the closest thing Texas has to a parent trigger law for individual charter campuses. A parent trigger effectively allows the parents of the student at a specific campus to charterize the school, allowing it to run as its own program within this public school district. California, Vermont, and Louisiana are among a number of states with such laws, and while, as I mentioned, Texas does have one right now, it's not a strong one. We think it can be improved greatly to further empower parents for an individual campus. You can read more about all these initiatives in TPPF's paper on home rule districts, entitled "Improving Efficiency and Local Control in Texas Education." Today we've got a panel here to discuss that paper and their own vision of local control, and give us a good swath of perspectives on the issue. We've got a representative from teachers in the state, we've got a state representative, we've got activist groups. We're going to have or education activists, excuse me, we're going to have a representative from school administrators with us as well. However, we did have a last-second cancellation, so before we get started, when we move into the Q&A, I would encourage any educators or administrators in the audience with us to, please speak up and offer some comments on this issue. We'd love to have them as part of this panel as well. And with that, I would like to get started and introduce our first panelist, Representative Phil King. Phil King is the representative from the 61st District. He represents the people of Parker and Wise counties in the Texas legislature, and currently serves as a member of the House Committee on Elections and the House Committee on Urban Affairs.
Somebody, we've got a newly elected, almost state representative, Steve Coach. If you hadn't met him, just he's will be replacing Rob Eisler. He's been a good friend and a good member, and Steve is as well. I was trying to think, because you don't have an opponent at all on the call, do you?
Kind of not.
Kind of not. I mean, you've got like a libertarian or something, so you're effectively elected. So anyway, so just so everybody put a face to it. I got up really early this morning and was trying to kind of pin some notes on trying to think how to explain this, because it's, to some extent, it delves in the details always, and it's still very much in the conceptual stage. But so if you'll kind of bear with me while I'm kind of working through notes that I'm still working through, let me see if I can't kind of explain at least what my thoughts are on this. Start off kind of at a high level. We all know this, but really there's two big issues on the funding side of education. One is adequacy, and of course that's the whole pie. That's how much money, state, federal, and local, do you assemble and put into education at large in Texas. So that's the adequacy side. And then there's the equity side, of course there's lawsuits on both of these. And equity is simply, it says that once you determine how much money you're putting in the total pie, how do you divide it up? How do you divide it between the school districts? How do you assign it to students? How do you deal with all the different issues? How do you cut it up? We all know of all the tremendous inequities that are out there in the equity side of the equation. I've got 18 school districts, and all of them are different in their funding levels. My favorite is Northwest ISD, which if you take in all dollars, including what they spend on debt service, they're spending a little over $15,000 total funding per student a year. Azle ISD, which is homogeneous in every respect, culture, economy, people, it's just literally across the street, is spending about $8,000 per student. So there's tremendous inequities across the board. And we all see those in really any compared school districts you look at. So if you really look at this from the 50,000 foot level, there's two things that are really, I think, very hard to reconcile here, and I guess it's something of a paradox. On the one hand, in terms of adequacy, we've had a tremendous infusion of cash into public education over the last 10 years or so. For example, in the last 10 years, adjusted for inflation, total education spending, total state, federal, and local combined, has increased in Texas at almost twice the rate of the student body population. In other words, the funding we've been putting in education over the last 10 years has been increasing at about twice the rate that our student body population has been increasing, yet with no significant improvement in graduation rates or dropout rates really to point to as a result. Similarly, if you look from 1999 to 2009, in Texas, state education, just the state share of it, spending rose by 95%. And during that same time period, student enrollment only increased by 20%. So state spending over the 10 years, 99 to 2009, we increased 95%, but we only had a student enrollment increase of about 20%. Another example, school bond debt. This again is adjusted for inflation. School bond debt has increased over the last 10 years by 167%. I think it's up to something like $80 billion now statewide. Don't hold me that number, but I think that's pretty close. So again, we've had this tremendous infusion of cash into public education on the one hand. However, on the other hand, our school districts tell us, and I believe them, that education funds are very limited and very scarce. Our local schools are legitimately under difficult budget pressures. We can say, well, they're not cutting enough or being efficient enough, but as you go talk to them and you work on them, they are feeling legitimate budget pressure. They're short on funds. The teacher comp's not what any of us want us to be. So on the one hand, we've got all this money that's gone into public education, and on the other hand, we've got school districts that paradoxically are really strapped for funding. So how do you reconcile that? On the one hand, we're putting all the money in, and on the other hand, schools just continue to be shorter and shorter on basic funding. So how do you reconcile that? Well, here's Phil's theory for what it's worth. And let me preface this saying I'm not an education expert. I have taught. I used to teach, but that was at the university level, and it's a lot different than teaching public school level. But I'm by no means an expert, but I do understand business, and I do understand management principles, as I know a lot of people in this room do, and how management is supposed to function. And I think, looking at it from those levels, I think from those perspectives, I think this 40-year experiment of having the state and the federal government involved in running public education has really been a failure. You know, it started in Texas really with don't pass, don't pass, don't play, remember back in the 70s? And it really culminated with No Child Left Behind at the state level and then later at the federal level. And we all remember how it was. There was need to, something had to happen. I mean, back in the 70s when I graduated high school, we had kids legitimately, or literally, graduating high school all across Texas that in many cases couldn't even read the diploma that they were being handed when they walked the stage. And so we had this dilemma, but instead of supporting, I think, instead of supporting and trusting local school boards and parents and teachers to fix the problem, big government, the state and the Fed decided to intervene, and they decided to intervene in a big way into something that had traditionally been a local function, a local matter, public education, local independent school district. In effect, what happened was when they decided to intervene, at least in Texas, the state told TEA basically to go make these 1,100 school districts perform. Well, what happens when one government agency is told to tell other government agencies to go perform? Well, the way they do that is the same way centralized government always does. It's by creating programs and reports and standards and measures and tests. And then when that doesn't succeed, the legislature reconvenes and ultimately TEA creates more programs and more reports and more standards and more tests and more measures and on and on and on. And in short, when you compel a single agency to go control 1,100 agencies, you create dramatic bureaucracy. And I think, just looking at it again from the outside, from a management perspective, what this did was it forced our schools to move money and, more importantly, move focus out of the classroom and over to the administrative side of education. And the result is today that non-teaching positions in recent years, really as far back as I've looked, have been increasing at twice the rate of non-teaching positions have been increasing at twice the rate of teaching positions. We now have only 50% of employees of the 645,000, I think it is, people employed in public education in Texas. Only 50% of them are teachers, and that's a declining number. I believe that rate still continues to increase. If you chart out, if you put growth in non-teaching positions and growth in teaching positions over the last 20 years, growth in teaching positions, surprisingly, exactly tracks growth in student body population. Growth in non-teaching positions is at double that rate. Double that rate. And we've also, because of that being forced by the increased bureaucracy to shift that money out of the classroom, the focus out of the classroom over to the administrative side, we've also ended up with this kind of cookie-cutter approach to instruction and management in our public schools. Now, you know, we conservatives, we always say that when the state regulates business, what does it do? When the state steps in and begins to over-regulate business, what happens? Their inefficiencies increase, their productivity decreases, they don't make money, they don't create jobs. We end up effectively adding to their cost of doing business by increasing the regulation. So why do we think it's any different with our local school districts? Why do we think that it's the worst thing we can do as conservatives, and me as a Republican, to go in and begin to regulate business, because I know the effect it's going to have on it. But for some reason, I think that when I'm going to go in and heavily regulate schools, it's not going to do the same thing. It's not going to decrease their efficiency and increase their cost of doing business. And frankly, we don't have a lot of money to put into education right now, so we've got to find ways to help them cut their costs of doing business. You know, remember, they're actually called ISDs, independent school districts. And it makes you wonder whatever happened to our conservative philosophy and belief in local control. And I tell you from a management perspective, another problem is with this top-down centralized approach where the state and the Fed are so heavily involved in public education, from a management perspective, there is ultimately no one in charge. There is such overlapping control and authority between the Fed and the state and the locals that there is no clear chain of command and colonel. There's no clear responsibility and there's no clear accountability in public education. There's no one that you can ultimately point the finger to and point the blame at. And there's also no one that you can ultimately point to and congratulate on the successes. There is not a clear line of command, a clear line of responsibility, and a clear line of accountability in public education. And you know how it is that the state blames the local districts for their failures and for their cost increase. The local school districts blame the legislature then turns around and blames TDA. I mean, it's just this ultimate finger pointing game because you do not have the buck stopping anywhere, as Truman said. So, and I will suggest to you that if we continue on the same path, we'll have another session this next time, and you know what we'll do? We'll further empower TDA, and we'll further have them go do more and more control, and it's going to end up, what was it Einstein that said that the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and over and expect different results. So we've been doing this for 40 years and heading in the same direction. So let me suggest a solution, and I think it's really a very simple structural reform, and it's a little bit radical, and it's very much conceptual. But we've been calling it home rule school districts. The red place in the education code can't bring it about, and even if you did, it doesn't really accomplish much. So this is really talking about a whole new concept, rewriting entirely that statute. But basically what it does is it attempts to give local districts the option of putting independence back into the independent school district. It allows for local school districts by vote of the local community to opt out of most state regulation and receive their funding as a block grant. Right. Now, I think this would accomplish a couple of things. One, I think it would dramatically cut their cost of doing business and allow school districts to begin that process of shifting money back from the administrative side back over to the classroom, where I know they want it to be, that not just the money in, but their focus as well. It would allow for strategic use of their resources. Every school district is different. I mean, it is dramatically different how you educate, or your education process and system in Dallas than it is in Weatherford and Mahia in Lago, or wherever you're at. But each school district is substantially different, even those, frankly, that are next door to each other. And our state-dictated cookie-cutter approach to how they have to spend their money and manage their system is ridiculously inefficient. I'll give you a great example of one of my school supers who was supposed to be here today, had to cancel. But he gives a great example because the money is so often pigeonholed by our cookie-cutter approach and top-down dictates on how they have to spend their money. And he gave a great example. He said, he's in Decatur, which is kind of a half-ag, half-oil and gas community. And he said, I've got all this money that is designated for vocational ed. But he said, Bill, I don't need that much money in there. He said, I'd really like to take that money and shift it over into this or this or this, and they're not allowed to do that. They don't have the freedom not only to place that money in different areas, but they also don't have the freedom to strategically know that money is block granted to them, know that it's going to be block granted the next year and the next year, and they don't have the freedom to do as we like to do in business and try to strategically plan, save, and to use that money in the out years. Wow, if I know this money's coming in and I've got the freedom to do it, you're not going to give me 30 seconds on that. Okay. I'm getting closer, but I'm not quite. But they don't have the freedom to exercise strategic use of their resources. I think it would also allow for creativity. I mean, in reality, where do we really think those best practices in education are going to come from? We really think they're going to come out of some agency in Austin or Washington, or do we really think they're going to come out of some committee in Austin or Washington? No, those best practices are going to come out of 1,100 plus school districts that are freed up to practice creativity and to be strategic in the classroom and in their administrative practices. It's not going to come out of Austin. Now, I've been told that unregulated school districts will blow it. That's what happened before. If you don't regulate them, they'll blow it. Well, there's 2,500 plus unregulated private schools in Texas, and they haven't grown. We had a long history, well over 100 years in Texas, of education that's working very well in an independent, unregulated environment. And frankly, as a safeguard, I would suggest that home rule school districts, where the school district has voted and stepped into the deregulation, I would suggest that they remain under the same testing system, whatever that testing system is. And if they lose their recognized status, then they have to come back under state scrutiny. They step out of the home rule freedom and back under state regulation. Because the theory of state regulation is if they're performing, they don't need it, right? And I think that'll be a tremendous incentive for those home rule school districts to get to remain a block grant funding center. The fact that knowing that if they lose their recognized status, or wherever we set the bar, that if they lose that, then they'll simply come back under regulation again. So if you do have schools fail, we will have a very, very good safety net there. And finally, I guess the most important thing. After all, who do we really trust to know how to educate our kids anyway? Do we really trust Austin, or do we really trust Washington? Or do we really trust parents and teachers and local administrators and school board members who are part of that community and are there because they want to educate kids? The bottom line, I think, is that if we conservatives really, really believe in local control, we really believe in that, then we've got to have the courage to begin to push autonomy back down to the local level, turn this tremendous ship around, and get education handed back to our locals who frankly are much more equipped to manage and do. And I think that's it. I only wanted to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Our next speaker is Jamie Story, the president of the Citizen Leader Alliance. The mission of Citizen Leader Alliance is to reestablish limited government, free market, and individual liberty as principles of the core American system. Previously, Jamie served as president of the Grassroots Institute. During that time, the Institute doubled its budget, tripled numbers of contributors, achieved unprecedented media success, and became the go-to source for free market policy research in Hawaii. And before moving to Hawaii, Story was an education policy analyst here at TPPF. Please welcome Jamie Story.
James, thank you so much to TPPF for inviting me back here. I was honored to speak almost a year ago at the Healthcare Compact Policy Primer that we had here at TPPF. So that was just shortly after I started my current position with the Citizen Leader Alliance, or CLA as we like to call it. So I'm glad to be back talking about education, which is something I actually know a little bit about. So thank you guys for inviting me. Just to give you a little background on CLA, James read the mission to you, so I won't do that. But we got started a couple of years ago as a group of business and community leaders in Texas who are concerned about the direction of our state and our country. And you read the mission, which is about limited government, free markets, and individual liberty. But in those couple of years of existence, CLA has realized something, that no matter how great we get Texas fixed, or how great on a path we get our state, if the feds continue to overregulate us in areas that should be left to the states, our reforms will have little impact. That was the underlying assumption and premise of the Healthcare Compact, which was our major legislative reform in 2011. We worked with TPPF and several other groups here in Austin to get that passed at the state level. But I think that goes for the local level too. Ultimately, there are very few, if any, public policy solutions that are best solved by a one-size-fits-all model. So at CLA, we believe that these challenges are not things that can be solved by policy reform, but better by governance reform. In other words, that it's not about what is decided, but about who does the deciding. And the closer we can get those decisions to the people, we believe, the better. So at the national level, of course, we call that federalism. At the state and local level, we call that local control. So that brings us to our topic today, which is home rule school districts. And at CLA, we completely agree with the premise of home rule school districts, that the more decisions we can take from Austin and give to superintendents and principals and teachers and parents, the better off our education, our students will be. So today, I'll spend a few minutes talking about some of the benefits of home rule districts. I'll maybe mention a couple of ways that we could build even upon further than what TPPF has proposed here today. And then I'll make a few broader comments on school choice, or on school reform here in Texas in general. So a couple of the benefits. One, I think, one of the biggest ones probably has to do with teaching. The research all shows that the most important education factor within the school anyway is the quality of the teacher. If we free superintendents and principals to hire who they want, to compensate those people competitively, we're going to increase our teaching quality. We'll open up a whole new pool of potential teaching applicants, maybe individuals who have formerly taught in other states but aren't certified yet in Texas, maybe retired scientists, retired business people, maybe even college professors who would be willing to teach in public schools if the barriers of entry weren't so high. So that will allow principals to choose the best of the best to teach their students, and they'll have a larger pool from which to choose people that feel hard to fill subjects, such as math and science. In addition, if we release them from the minimum salary schedule, I think that will foster innovation and competitiveness in the way that we pay teachers. We can reward them, as we should, for effectiveness. We can reward them if, say, we get creative and implement a blended learning model that enables them to teach more students. We could reward them and pay them accordingly. So, speaking of blended learning, another huge benefit, I think, to home rule districts is innovation. Right now we have an outdated, inefficient delivery model that's based on an agrarian system that's completely out of touch with today's technology. It doesn't allow us to address the challenges, or the changes in technology and the challenges in demographics that we're facing as a state. Just a couple of examples. If we get rid of seat time funding, if we get rid of class size requirements, and hopefully in addition to those things, loosen some of the other financial restrictions that Representative King mentioned, principals and teachers will actually have an incentive to embrace some of these new technologies. Have any of you in the audience heard of the Khan Academy? Yeah, it's a website. It's got like 3,000 videos, almost any topic you want to learn about. They're by really good lecturers, and they're online, and you can learn from them. You've probably all heard of TED Talks. Same idea, right? Except they're in little 20-minute bites. The Udacity is another free online offering, course offerings. And then Harvard, Stanford, MIT, and other schools are beginning to offer many of their courses online for free. There's no reason that we need to be stuck with the same model. We can supplement teachers instructing students with these online free technologies from across the country and across the world. And you don't necessarily need to be in a classroom setting, or at least in a traditional classroom setting, in order to take advantage of those technologies. But right now we're paying schools based on seat time, and so they don't really have the flexibility with their dollars to be able to take advantage of some of those things. In addition to actually imparting the knowledge to students, you have online tutorials that can teach them, but can also, in the meantime, track how well they're learning, and can catch much faster than a teacher can in a room of 30 kids. These programs will show instantaneously that students maybe have misunderstood a concept and will reteach it right then instead of waiting until the test comes around in a week or two. The best teachers could even webcast or video their lectures so that students across the district or across even the state could take advantage. And then those teachers could be compensated accordingly for educating more students. So the possibilities are endless. I don't know about you guys, but I don't expect the nimble TEA to embrace these technologies as quickly as home rule districts and individual campuses could. So I do think that home rule district law could provide a more responsive laboratory for these technologies so that it could encourage faster acceptance by the state as a whole. So that's a few of the benefits. I'd like to now suggest a couple of additional improvements that could be made to the home rule proposal that TPPF is making today. I think first of all, it's imperative that choice be part of the plan. Home rule districts are parallel to charter schools within the education code. They're very similar to them, but the one main difference is that charter schools are schools of choice. So if a charter school is underperforming, the parents who have kids in that charter can take them out and can go back to plan B or plan A of the traditional school district that they're assigned to. Similarly, if the charter school is doing really well, other parents can try and get their kids in there. Home rule districts aren't the same way. So while I think that home rule districts on the whole will do a better job educating students than districts do when they have their hands tied by the state, that might not be the case for every child. And I think those children need a backup plan, an option to go back into a different school, a different district that might serve them better. So the same would be accomplished by dollars following the students. And that's something maybe we could discuss in the Q&A. And then second, and I'm going to open a big can of worms probably, I think we should consider allowing home rule districts to be freed from the accountability system. I know that a lot of people in this room have worked on that. A lot of people in this office. I worked on it 5 or 6 years ago here at TPPF, and I think we've made vast improvements in the accountability system. When I've kind of talked to people about this in the past few weeks, they said, no way, Jamie, we need to give this a chance to let it work. The problem is we're not going to know for 10 years if it's worked. And in the meantime, you've had kids finishing high school, maybe not being reached, and maybe it does work, but in the meantime, there's all these, like I mentioned earlier, great technologies that can really assess without tests, can assess and measure how well students are learning. And I think if we kind of stick ourselves to only using this one accountability system without exploring these other options, we're doing our students a disservice. So I think home rule districts, if freed from the accountability system, could start exploring those other options. I also think they might choose to use other outcome measures. They might choose to use average SAT scores, average number of, or percentage of kids who are accepted to four-year colleges. I think as long as those goals are specific and part of their charters and made transparent to parents, and that there are ramifications if they don't reach those goals, I think that should be acceptable. I also think, in addition to that, that it would be a huge incentive for the districts to take part in the home rule district system. I think that parents and teachers and administrators alike are frustrated by the accountability system, and this might be one more incentive for them to take advantage of the system that they haven't taken advantage of before. So, all that being said, I think home rule school districts hold great promise for as laboratories of reform, and that the improvements suggested by TPPF and perhaps others can empower them even further. But I will want to make one final point. I'll make the case that we need to move beyond tinkering with the education code. We need something bold. If you look across the country, other states are taking education reform more seriously than we are. Florida gets a lot of attention for its school choice system, but even places like DC, New Jersey, California, Colorado, even our neighbor Louisiana are developing comprehensive ways of addressing the student achievement gap. Just one example, Louisiana, just in the past couple months, has passed legislation that puts limits on teacher tenure, links their compensation partly to student performance, makes it easier for communities to set up charter schools, and expands the number of low-income students who can use private school vouchers. But in Texas, we have no such plan. It's like we're waiting around for the next round of school choice lawsuit rulings to come down, and then we'll tweak, or maybe we'll even overhaul the school finance system to appease the court, but we don't actually address school reform. My fear in the upcoming session is that lawmakers will be timid, that they will think, well, we've got these rulings coming, we don't know when they're going to come, so let's not put education reform on the agenda. Let's wait, and then we can address this in special session. But I would propose the opposite. If we wait to do that, we're only going to be talking about school finance. We're not going to be talking about education reform. So I would say let's take advantage of this time. Representative King and other representatives who are here in the audience, let's take advantage of this time in committees in the Senate and House. Let's take advantage of this time to do something big and bold. So we're going to need lawmakers to step up to the plate, we're going to need the governor to step up to the plate, and we're going to need a plan. So CLA is working on that plan right now. We've partnered with a diverse group of charters and school districts and business leaders and education reformers to develop a transformational reform agenda that will propel Texas through the demographic and economic challenges ahead. We don't see that we can get transformational change with the current education code. So our plan actually goes beyond tweaking the code and creates an entire alternative code under which districts can choose to operate. I hope I'm not the only one in the room who's skeptical that the state can ever fix our current education code from the center. But if any of you are interested in working with us on this plan, please contact me afterwards. So in conclusion, CLA is supportive of home rule districts. TPPF's proposal is a big step in the right direction of strengthening them. But ultimately, we need bold, transformational change in our public school system, and we need it soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Our final presenter for the day will be Lonnie Hollingsworth. Lonnie is the Director of Legal Services and Governmental Relations at the Texas Classroom Teachers Association. He has worked there since 1985. as an attorney and lobbyist for TCTA for over 27 years now. He has been involved in every major school finance and reform bill considered by the Texas legislature since 1985. Lonnie.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks to the Texas Public Policy Foundation for inviting me to give kind of a countervailing view to some of the things that you've heard. And I agree with a whole lot of what you've heard. Just let me start out right there. And and Jamie mentioned federalism. And when people ask me about, local control and are you against local control, clearly we're not against local control. However, too much local control is not a good thing. I mean, too much local control is what created our current school finance system. And at some point, you need some kind of, any system of government tends to accumulate too much power unless there are checks and balances. That's federalism. So you need checks and balances from the local level at the state level too. And that happened. That happened in 1983 when the Ronald Reagan's National Commission on Excellence in Education released the report, A Nation at Risk. And you may recall that. The response of Texas was to create the Select Committee on Public Education, headed by Ross Perot. And that created House Bill 72, which created a whole lot of process-based reforms. It included adoption of the essential elements and a series of reforms such as no pass, no plays, Representative King mentioned, elementary class size caps, and created an appointed SPOE with general rulemaking authority. And this is about when I started in this business. And at the time, yeah, there were too many rules. State Board of Education, support bill, all kinds that would take us back to just the federal standards on testing. We would be there with you. We think there's too much emphasis on testing. It is true that a whole lot of the problem is coming from the federal level. Don't know what we can do about that, and I don't see how home rule school districts can get out of it because the federal government holds 10% of the funding as their incentive for school districts complying with their requirements. You may recall when Governor Perry declined to apply for the Race to the Top money from the federal government because of the strings attached. TCTA stood with Governor Perry because we agreed. We don't think there should be a requirement from the U.S. Department of Education that teachers be evaluated and compensated primarily on the basis of high-stakes testing. The other concern I know from Governor Perry's perspective was the national curriculum standards. And TCTA is not a union. We do not have collective bargaining in Texas, but we do believe that there should be some minimum standards at the state level to make sure that districts don't make arbitrary decisions with regard to teacher hiring and firing. We don't have tenure in the state of Texas, but there is a requirement that's been in effect since 1981 that districts have to have a reason to let teachers go at the end of the year. They get an abbreviated hearing at the school board level, and there are very, very few appeals of that decision that go to the state level. And the argument is also made that somehow by deregulating schools, that is going to create a more efficient system. Well, history simply does not show that that's the case. First of all, charter schools are not more efficient than traditional public schools. As we see in more and more studies come out about charter schools, we show that as a rule they tend to underperform traditional public schools, although we don't really have a whole lot of data on that because 33% of the charter schools are not even evaluated under the same accountability system. And I left with you a chart that I did that looks a whole lot like a chart that my friend Byron Schlomock made when he used to work for TPPF. And I've done this for some time. And what I do is I track the increase in operating expenditures per pupil with the increase in teacher salaries. And I adjust it somewhat for teacher salaries per pupil. And this is just from 2000. But if you look at the chart, operating expenditures per pupil have increased 42.7% since 2000. But the teacher salary per pupil has increased only 26.5%. So if teacher salaries had kept up with operating expenditures per pupil, they'd be $6,000 higher than they are now. We share the same goals as this organization. I've heard many conservative organizations articulate, and that is
you want to drive dollars to the classroom. But if you make it easier for school districts to go home rule, you're eliminating your ability to do just that. And we think that actually you're going to go against efficiency, and and also the last chart that I have is just select provisions of the Texas Education Code that do not apply to home rule school districts. Now these are not the provisions that I am protecting and the reason that we are against home rule, but there are some provisions in there that have been put in there as policy provisions and as parent rights and student rights and benefits. And that's kind of the interesting thing about it. If you know, a mandate at the school district level, is it a mandate if you give a parent or a teacher a right to do something? Or is it empowering the parent or the teacher or the student? I mean, from the school district perspective, it looks like a mandate. From my perspective, it may be reallocating power to the teacher or to the parent. I support laws that give teachers more authority over their classroom. To the school district, that's going to look like a mandate. But in my mind, that's just a way of the state allocating its responsibility for providing for a system of free public schools. But if you look at these select provisions of the Texas Education Code that do not apply to home rule school districts, just look at this. So parents have the right to petition the school board to have their student transferred to another campus. Parents have a right to transfer a student who's a victim of sexual abuse or assault or bullying, or in some instances actually have the perpetrator transferred. The requirement that students recite the Pledge of Allegiance, the requirement that school districts provide a minute of silence for students to pray, meditate, or engage in any other activity they see fit. The Religious Viewpoints Anti-Discrimination Act, I'm sure you supported Representative King, which requires school districts to create a limited public forum at which students can espouse their religious beliefs in any manner they choose. The requirement that parents be given reasonable access to the principal to request a change of the student's class or teacher. Parent right to review all instructional materials. Parent requirement that school districts obtain written permission from the parent before a student is subjected to psychological examinations, or before a student is videotaped or that has their voice recorded. The parent right to object to psychiatric or psychological treatment, or refuse to consent to the administration of psychotropic drugs. The list goes on. Among the other things is this whole idea of the required curriculum as adopted by the State Board of Education. This would not apply to home rule school districts. So all of the controversy you've seen about the State Board of Education and the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills and whether or not they will require teaching of alternative theories with regard to things like creationism, etc. None of that applies. If these provisions should not be applicable to home rule school districts, why are they applicable to any school district? These are policy provisions that the state of Texas has adopted that it has seen fit since it pays for such a large part of the public schools. And so if you want to review some of these requirements, let's do it as a whole, but let's not do it through the back door or through the creation of home rule school districts. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all very much. We're going to start the Q&A here, and I'd actually like to ask the first question with the panel. Whether we're talking about TPPF's vision of this reform or CLA's vision of this reform, one of the vital, probably the most vital component is parental involvement. And if we're going to empower them, they need to use that power. So my question for the panel is, what can we do to get our parents more involved and more engaged? Or Lonnie and LK is going to be working more with the teachers.
I mean, I think this does it. I mean, you see higher parental involvement with schools of choice, whether they're private, whether they're charter schools. And these aren't exactly schools of choice, but they are districts in which the parents and the voters have taken the step of charterizing these districts, if you will, and then have to take the steps of the parent triggers or or repealing the charters if needed.
I think too that, that's the reason we want to require that it be a public vote. Because you want this to be, you want it to be offered to the community. You want it to be argued and debated within the community. And then it's an opportunity for the community to step up and say, we think we can do this better. We think we can make our schools better. And we think if we're given the freedom and we're block granted the funds, that we can do a better job. And I think that in itself, if the citizens are voting for it, if they're debating it, they're hearing the discussions, and it'll be wide and broad, you bet that, that if they vote to do that, I think they're going to take ownership for it. And I think that will, by itself, instill that community to go in and try and participate in the schools and make sure that that it works. I think it's very essence of getting more parental involvement is for the parents to say, we think we can do a better job locally managing our schools at the local level.
Let me weigh in just a second on that. Whatever governance structure you have, whether it's a home rule school district or an independent school district, if there's not transparency, if the parents don't have the information and the ability to understand that information, they're never going to be empowered. I mean, when I try to go through and get the information for the chart that I produced, it's extremely difficult to go to the TEA website and try to extract all this information. So I think one goal that we can all have is let's make the information available to the parents, to the public, and make it put it in a fashion that they can understand.
Right there, sir.
Is there a way we can force transparency with this so that when they vote on it, they not only vote for this adoption of this new system, but school districts are required to hold elections at a time of the year when people actually turn out and vote, as opposed to having 1.5% of the population elect an ISD board, doing it on even years in November during general election times, so that people are actually voting for these folks. Or is it too big of a nut to bite off?
Well, I think we've done that to some extent by requiring uniform election dates. So there has been some attention paid to that. Because you did have school districts that would, set the school bond election on a date when only teachers and parents would show up. So you did have those issues. I think we've made some steps in. But going to a home rule school district doesn't take away the transparency things that you put in place. That funding is still going to come. Whatever the formula is, they're going to get that same amount of money. It's going to come with the same reporting requirements to the comptroller that are made now, and the same transparency requirements that are already in state statutes where you can look and see where expenditures are. And I'm not saying that doesn't need to be expanded. I believe it does. But I don't think going to a block grant, locally controlled school system necessarily, I think that's separate and distinct from issues of the financial accountability that we already have in place and that we're actually trying to implement.
Yes, ma'am, right there.
I worked in the schools back when we didn't have this current regulation. I watched the regulation come. I watched the failure come with it. I am so excited about what you talked about today. I've been talking about the point of diminishing return with our school system. It's broken. We can put a lot of money in, we get a little bit out. I would say to you, Mr. Hollingsworth, we're committed to it, and it doesn't mean they can't change as they go along in this development. I would also suggest, you're right, there will be massive failures and massive successes. But from the successes, we can look at it and see what other districts might want to do. We got bound, shackled, and tied people trying to educate our kids. It's not working. Innovation is not allowed. We've got to untie them. Our educators would have fixed it long ago if they could under the current system. It is broken. I would make a couple of suggestions to this group. One is, I would say, there's a difference between funding following the child and parent choice. Parent choice may mean that a parent has a choice between one horrible school and one not quite so horrible. But if we look at funding following the child, that brings in the possibility of free enterprise, really innovation, creating new schools similar to what you're talking about. And we believe in the brain trust of our country to solve these problems. They're not allowed to. The other thing I would say that we need to look at is the product we're seeking. we are hearing that the students that are coming out are not prepared for the workforce that we have currently available. We need to go to business. We need to go find out what do we need to produce. When our TEKs are looked at, we need to make sure they're what we need, not what some bureaucracy said. We're going to teach our kids this, this, and this. Parents need involvement in that. Business people need involvement in that. And when we get through with all of this, we'll have a product we know is right for our people. I could talk more. I will stop there. I'm excited. Thank you for this today.
Just to build on that a little bit on putting parents in charge, last year there was a bill introduced called Taxpayer Savings Grants, and I'd like to know what the possibility of that being reintroduced this year. And it basically was a voucher program which put roughly 60% of what the state was paying and give that directly to the child, and they could use it for private school, charter school, wherever. So basically the money followed the child, put the parents in charge. That way they're looking at it. If they think it's going well, they're going to be involved. If they don't like their options, they'll go back to the public school. But it gives the public schools some competition, and without that we wouldn't have Apple, and we wouldn't have Facebook, and we wouldn't have Google. So that's what we need. Thank you.
My question is more directed towards Representative King. You spoke about applying business principles in the school districts, and I'd like to point out they're not businesses; they're governmental entities, and they're not allowed to operate like businesses. So I can't see how that approach would actually work. And we don't have one public school system in Texas. We have over 1,050 of them, and they're all different. They're not. They have similarities, but they're all different. And one of the things that I have observed, and by the way, when my daughters were in high school, I attended every meeting of the Board of Trustees of my school district. I did that for 6 years. Quite often I was the only non-affiliated person with the school district there. I have a pretty good understanding how at least mine work. I live in small town Texas. And about half of the state lives in small town Texas. And one of the things that people who propose education reform, and I say that in quotes, what they fail to realize is that in small town Texas, the community's identity is tied up with their school system. That's the center of social activity and community spirit in small town Texas. The school plays, the Christmas events, the sports teams. And so when people here in Austin start out calling for education reform by saying our school system has failed, you're telling half of the state that their community has failed. And that's when they stop listening to you. You need to get beyond that. I agree with the people here who have said that if you want to adopt business principles, I would suggest you let the funding be a voucher per student, and then free up the school districts from having to follow anything but the standards for performance. Let them compete with private schools exactly under the exact same terms. If you do that, you'll find in small town Texas, the private schools won't be able to compete with the ISDs, because the ISDs will respond. But if you want to follow business principles, let them go all the way. Free them of state regulation with the exception of performance standards, and give the money to the student. The Constitution of the state doesn't say that the state has to own the public school system. It just says it has to provide a free public education.
Hi, I'm Representative Hollingsworth, and I appreciate, Phil, what you brought out. And the block grants is actually kind of a government function. I mean, we get block grants in healthcare and that type of thing. You've presented an option. I mean, I think we've all agreed that the public school system is limping along, if not broken. We see that in colleges who are now having to do remedial work to get the kids that have graduated from high schools ready to take college classes that should have been done in high school. You have brought an option, a solution that we can debate vigorously. Jamie, you've offered an option that we can debate vigorously. Mr. Hollingsworth, as I heard you, and maybe I'm, was not hearing everything, but it seemed like you were more interested in criticizing two options than providing another option. Can you tell me, if I missed it, do you have an option of what we can look at next session?
Yeah, first of all, as far as I understood, that was my function today, was to criticize the other option. I do not agree that our schools are failing. I think, do we have a lot of challenges? Yes. But if you look at where our students are doing, anytime there's the National Assessment of Education Progress, you look at an objective statistical measure of where our students are doing, we do pretty good. And in Texas, we have a challenging student population. We have a high percentage of students who are limited English proficiency, English language learners. We have a high percentage of low socioeconomic students. Our students are difficult to teach, and yes, I think we do a very good job, and we don't spend a whole lot of money. I think conservatives have been successful in the state of Texas in creating a public education system. And what I think we should do is the same thing that we've been doing for the last several years. When you talk about bold education reform, I've been through periods of bold education reform, and what happens when you do that is you change things around. It creates a disruption. It is counterproductive. What we need to do is continue to do what we have been doing, and that is continue to raise the standards, to raise the bar, because every time you've done it, even though funding for education has been cut, the educators have met that standard, and they're going to continue to do that. We need to cut back as much as we can on emphasis on high-stakes testing, because at this point, the high-stakes testing system is the tail wagging the dog. So we need to address that. I have hopes that the legislature will address that next session. And I think that if we can go back, have a little more rationality in our accountability system, and continue that process of raising the bar and raising standards, we support that, and we'll work with you to do so.
Christine, where else but education do we manage success, measure success based on how much you spend? We're constantly being compared to other states, other countries on how much we spend per child. And when you think of that in a business context, how many businesses measure their success by do they measure by how high their overhead is? By how high their expenditures are? No, they measure it by what their profits are. And Jamie was speaking to this, but we've really got to get away from this attitude of measuring our success and how committed we are to public education based on how we compare with other states and what we spend. We should be measuring by our product. You should never measure success based on overhead. If you do that, you'll continue to pour more and more money in without any results. We need to measure success in schools by what our product is. The same way in business, you don't measure, if you've got two businesses and one of them spending $1 million a year and making $1 million, and the other one spending $500,000 a year and making $1 million, which one is really the successful company? Well, the one with half the overhead. Well, that's because profit is what counts. In a school, we should never be measuring our effectiveness or our commitment to education based on how we compare with another community or another state in our expenditures. We should be measuring it totally, completely, only by our product. If that takes a whole lot more money than another state, then we need to spend that whole lot more money. If it takes less money, then we need to be efficient and good stewards of the taxpayer dollar and spend less money. But we should quit trying to measure our effectiveness in education and commitment to it based on how much we spend relative to other states.
That was kind of my question. I just wanted to ask Mr. Hollingsworth, do you ever compare our output of children with the children around the world and how they rate in education?
It is difficult to get apples to apples comparison on that sort of thing. But if you compare student population to student population, again, I think America does pretty good. Yeah, our top students are not as good at math and science as the top students of other countries, and we need to work on that. But I think this idea that the American public education system is just failing compared to the rest of the world, and particularly here in Texas that we have a failed system, I don't think that's the case. I believe in our system, and I do think the state of Texas has the ability to continue to improve our public schools. I think, if you look at the history of education reform over the past 30 years, has it been a rough road? Sure it has. But I think we've done a pretty good job. We've had some good leaders. Governor Perry's been a great leader. We're going in the right direction, and I think we continue down that path. And yeah, I think any change should be incremental, because that has worked, and that's what's going to drive our system forward and continue to have us make the gains that we've made in the past.
I respectfully completely disagree. I think if you talk to any university professors, they will say that the high school public education system is failing them. I think if you talk to business leaders, they will say that the high school and maybe even college system is failing them. They can't hire the people they need here in Texas, and it's not just Texas, it's across the country. But you said a minute ago that you don't like big, bold reform because that disrupts the system. I think disruption to the system is exactly what's needed.
Yes, sir.
Once upon a time, they used to do differently in training teachers. I have a sister-in-law who is 93 right now, and she used to teach school a long time ago, back starting about in the 40s. And she finished Duke University, then she went to Louisiana Normal for a year to learn how to manage a classroom. And they don't do that anymore. And one of our problems is you've got a situation now where teachers are more challenged. They not only have to be teachers, they have to be social workers to get through things. And they need the training. And I don't think the training occurs at the teacher level that they really need to have to effectively supervise a bunch of people they're working with. So I think we've got a real problem there. And the problem is the minorities in Texas in 40, 50 years will be the majorities. The minorities are dropping out now. If they don't quit dropping out, don't keep them in school, the educational level of the community is going to drop. And when you have the educational level drop in a community like a domestic, organization such as we have a republic, you've got a problem. What do you want to do about it?
Yeah, I have a question concerning just a microcosm and staffing. I considered being a teacher at one point, and when I was looking at the stats, it said of the teachers who become new teachers, within the first year, 20% give up the profession, and within 5 years, 70% give up the profession. Which, statistically, you've got a better chance of storming the beaches of Normandy than you do being a career teacher. That's kind of scary. On the other end of the spectrum, I know people who are over 50 who were teachers who have 20 years of experience, and yet they can't get a job because they're too old to compete with the people who are fresh out of school. So as a result, they're knocked out of the profession. And so I'm just kind of curious if that single stat is an indication of the problem, and do you think home rule being able, the flexibility in the staffing would actually drastically increase your pool? And anyway, I'll let y'all elaborate.
Part of that's a compensation issue. I've got 2 kids who are teachers. One just quit teaching because she's actually making more money out of her Mary Kay business now than she's making teaching. It says something. But it's like I was in law enforcement for about 15 years. You have the same problem with public education that you have in law enforcement, is that you start off making pretty good money. I know my daughter started off in Pasadena with like $46,000 a year, which is a really good starting salary. And but the problem is it really doesn't go anywhere from there. And so I think part of the idea of allowing districts to manage their own school systems is it will open the opportunity up for competition and for them to compete for salaries and benefits and other things with neighboring school districts.